Ever wondered what you would do if you found a child unconscious in the park? When Mrs. Williams, a dedicated teacher, stumbled upon a young boy lying motionless near the playground, she couldn't have imagined the shocking discovery that awaited her at the emergency room. David, a quiet student from her school, was found with traces of Mrs. Williams enjoyed her evening walks through the park. It was her time to unwind after a long day of teaching, a moment to breathe and appreciate the small pleasures of life. The park was her sanctuary, a place where the troubles of the day melted away with each step she took along the winding paths. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a warm golden hue over the park. The playground, usually bustling with children's laughter, was now quieter as families began heading home for dinner. Mrs. Williams walked past the swings, the creaking sound of one gently swaying in the breeze, when something caught her eye. Near the slide, a small figure lay motionless. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the still form. As she got closer, she could see it was a young boy, no older than 8 or 9. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. Mrs. Williams dropped to her knees beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. "Hey, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. "Wake up, sweetheart." There was no response. Panic began to rise in her chest. She reached for her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she explained the situation to the operator. "There's a boy in the park, and he's not responding. He's near the playground, by the slide. Please, hurry." The operator assured her that an ambulance was on the way. Mrs. Williams stayed by the boy's side, checking his pulse and trying to keep calm. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, her mind racing with questions. Who was this boy? Why was he here alone? And what had happened to him? The sound of sirens in the distance brought a wave of relief. The ambulance arrived, and the paramedics quickly took over, assessing the boy's condition. Mrs. Williams watched anxiously as they worked, her heart heavy with worry. "Do you know this child?" one of the paramedics asked her. "I think he's a student at my school," she replied, trying to recall his name. "But I can't be sure. He looks familiar." They nodded and continued their work. Mrs. Williams decided to accompany the boy to the hospital, unable to shake the feeling of responsibility she felt for him. As they rode in the ambulance, she kept a close eye on him, silently praying he would be all right. Upon arrival at the emergency room, the boy was whisked away for further tests. Mrs. Williams was left in the waiting area, her thoughts swirling. The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency, but to her, everything seemed to move in slow motion. She felt helpless, sitting there with no answers. A nurse approached her after some time. "The doctors are doing everything they can," she said kindly. "Do you have any idea who he might be?" "I'm a teacher at the local elementary school," Mrs. Williams explained. "I think he's one of my students, but I can't be certain. I wish I could remember his name." The nurse nodded. "We'll need to contact the school and see if we can identify him. In the meantime, please try to stay calm. We'll keep you updated." Mrs. Williams thanked her and returned to her seat, her mind racing. She thought about the children in her class, their faces and names flashing through her memory. One face seemed to stand out more than the others, a quiet, shy boy who often seemed withdrawn. Could it be him? Hours passed, and finally, a doctor approached her with an update. "We've identified the boy," he said, his expression serious. "His name is David. He's a student at your school." Mrs. Williams' heart sank. She remembered David now, always sitting at the back of the class, rarely speaking unless spoken to. She felt a pang of guilt for not recognizing him sooner. "We found traces of a rare toxin in his blood," the doctor continued. "It's something we don't see very often. We're doing everything we can to stabilize him." "A toxin?" Mrs. Williams echoed, her eyes widening. "How could that happen?" "We're not sure yet," the doctor replied. "The police have been notified, and they'll need to ask you some questions. In the meantime, please know that we're doing everything we can for David." Mrs. Williams nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. She thanked the doctor and sat back down, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just learned. How had David come into contact with a toxin? And what did this mean for his recovery? As she waited, she reflected on her memories of David. He had always been a quiet child, often lost in his own world. She remembered moments when she'd seen glimpses of his potential, a shy smile when he understood a lesson, a spark of curiosity when something piqued his interest. She wondered what his home life was like and whether anyone had noticed the signs that something might be wrong. The police arrived, and Mrs. Williams recounted the events of the evening as best she could. They asked her about David's family, his friends, any possible explanations for what had happened. She provided what little information she had, feeling increasingly frustrated by her own lack of knowledge. "I wish I could tell you more," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "But David is such a quiet child. He doesn't share much." The officers thanked her and promised to keep her informed. As they left, Mrs. Williams felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The day had taken a toll on her, both physically and emotionally. Despite her fatigue, she knew she couldn't leave the hospital until she knew David was safe. She waited for hours, the minutes stretching into an eternity. Finally, the doctor returned with a hopeful update. "David is stable," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "He's still unconscious, but his condition is improving. We'll need to monitor him closely, but we're optimistic." Mrs. Williams felt a surge of relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Can I see him?" "Of course," the doctor replied. "But just for a few minutes. He needs to rest." She followed the doctor to David's room, her heart pounding. Seeing him lying there, so small and vulnerable, brought tears to her eyes. She sat beside his bed, gently taking his hand in hers. "You're going to be all right, David," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "We're all here for you. You're not alone." As she sat there, watching over him, Mrs. Williams made a silent promise to herself. She would do everything in her power to help David and ensure that he received the care and support he needed. She wouldn't let him slip through the cracks. Not this time. The hospital was a place of constant movement and muted urgency. Nurses and doctors hurried from room to room, their faces a mix of calm professionalism and subtle concern. Mrs. Williams sat in the waiting area, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of machinery filling the air. She couldn't shake the image of David lying unconscious, tubes and monitors attached to his small frame. A nurse approached her with a clipboard. "Mrs. Williams, can we have a word with you?" Mrs. Williams stood up, smoothing her skirt nervously. "Of course," she said, following the nurse to a small office where a doctor and a police officer waited. "Please, have a seat," the doctor said, gesturing to a chair. Mrs. Williams sat down, her heart pounding. "We've run several tests on David," the doctor began, his tone serious. "We found traces of a rare toxin in his blood. It's something we don't often see, and it's quite dangerous." Mrs. Williams felt a chill run down her spine. "A toxin? How could that happen?" The police officer leaned forward. "That's what we're trying to determine, ma'am. We need to ask you some questions about David and his background." Mrs. Williams nodded, trying to gather her thoughts. "David is one of my students. He's a quiet boy, keeps to himself mostly. I don't know much about his home life, but I can tell you what I know." The officer took out a notebook. "Anything you can share will be helpful. Do you know if David has any friends he spends time with? Anyone who might know more about his family situation?" Mrs. Williams thought for a moment. "He doesn't seem to have many close friends. He's always been a bit of a loner. I remember him sitting by himself during recess, reading or drawing." The doctor interjected, "Do you know if David has any medical conditions or allergies that we should be aware of?" "Not that I'm aware of," Mrs. Williams replied. "His records at school didn't mention anything unusual." The police officer made a few notes. "We've contacted the school to get more information, and a social worker will be here soon to provide some background on David's family. In the meantime, it would be helpful if you could stay available. We may need to ask you more questions as we learn more." Mrs. Williams agreed, feeling a mixture of frustration and helplessness. She wanted to do more, to find the answers that could explain how this had happened to David. As she returned to the waiting area, her mind raced with possibilities. Hours passed, and finally, the social worker arrived. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes, she introduced herself as Ms. Ramirez. "Thank you for being here, Mrs. Williams," Ms. Ramirez said, sitting beside her. "I understand you're David's teacher?" "Yes," Mrs. Williams replied. "I've been his teacher for the past year. I wish I could tell you more about him, but he's always been very reserved." Ms. Ramirez nodded. "David's family has been under observation for some time. His mother has been struggling to make ends meet, and there have been concerns about neglect. It's possible that his exposure to the toxin was accidental, but we need to investigate further." Mrs. Williams felt a surge of sympathy for David and his mother. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Right now, we're trying to piece together what happened," Ms. Ramirez said. "It would be helpful if you could provide any insights into David's behavior at school. Did he ever mention anything that might give us a clue about his home life?" Mrs. Williams thought back to the past school year. "He was always very quiet, but I did notice that he sometimes seemed tired, like he wasn't getting enough sleep. He never complained, but there were days when he looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders." Ms. Ramirez sighed. "That fits with what we know. His mother has been working multiple jobs to support them, and it's possible that David has been left to fend for himself more than a child his age should." As they spoke, a doctor approached them with a somber expression. "We've traced the toxin found in David's blood to a substance commonly found in household cleaning products. It's a rare occurrence, but it's possible he was exposed to it at home." Ms. Ramirez thanked the doctor and turned to Mrs. Williams. "This new information points to an accidental poisoning, but we need to be sure. I'll be visiting David's home to investigate further. Would you be willing to come with me? Sometimes having a familiar face can help in these situations." Mrs. Williams agreed without hesitation. "Of course. I want to do whatever I can to help David." The drive to David's home was filled with a tense silence. Mrs. Williams looked out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of what they might find. When they arrived, the small, run-down house seemed to confirm her worst fears. The yard was overgrown, and the paint on the house was peeling. Ms. Ramirez knocked on the door, and a tired-looking woman answered. Her eyes were red, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. Sanchez, I'm Ms. Ramirez from Child Protective Services," the social worker said gently. "This is Mrs. Williams, David's teacher. We're here to talk about what happened to David." Mrs. Sanchez's face crumpled, and she stepped aside to let them in. The inside of the house was cluttered, with piles of laundry and dishes scattered around. It was clear that Mrs. Sanchez was struggling to keep up with everything. "Please, have a seat," Mrs. Sanchez said, her voice shaky. "I don't know how this happened. I've been trying my best, but it's so hard." Ms. Ramirez sat down beside her. "We're here to help, not to judge. Can you tell us about the cleaning products you use? It's possible that David was accidentally exposed to something harmful." Mrs. Sanchez wiped her eyes and nodded. "I use whatever I can afford. Sometimes I get cleaning supplies from the dollar store. I never thought they could be dangerous." Mrs. Williams felt a pang of sympathy for the woman. It was clear she was doing her best under difficult circumstances. "We just want to understand what happened so we can make sure David is safe," she said gently. Ms. Ramirez asked to see the cleaning supplies, and Mrs. Sanchez led them to a small cupboard under the sink. Inside were several bottles of various cleaning products, many of them with warning labels. Ms. Ramirez took note of the brands and their ingredients. "It's possible that one of these products contained the toxin we found in David's blood," Ms. Ramirez said. "We'll need to test them to be sure." Mrs. Sanchez looked devastated. "I never meant to hurt him. I was just trying to keep the house clean." "We understand," Ms. Ramirez said. "Right now, our priority is making sure David gets better and that this doesn't happen again. We'll help you get safer cleaning supplies and support you in any way we can." Mrs. Williams felt a sense of relief. It was clear that Ms. Ramirez was committed to helping David and his mother. As they left the house, she made a silent promise to herself to do whatever she could to support them as well. Back at the hospital, Mrs. Williams sat by David's bedside, holding his hand. "You're going to be okay, David," she whispered. "We're all here for you, and we're going to make sure you're safe." As she watched over him, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to see it through. For David, and for every child who needed someone to stand by them, she would be that person. The hospital corridors seemed endless, filled with the faint beeping of machines and the soft murmur of voices. Mrs. Williams felt the weight of the past few days bearing down on her. She spent most of her time in David's room, watching over him, hoping for a sign of improvement. Occasionally, she would step out for a breath of fresh air, but her thoughts always remained with him. One afternoon, as Mrs. Williams sat by David's bedside, she noticed a flicker of movement. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment, she held her breath. Slowly, his eyes opened, unfocused and glazed. She gently squeezed his hand. "David, can you hear me?" she asked softly, leaning closer. David's eyes moved slowly around the room before settling on her. He looked confused and scared. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "You're in the hospital," Mrs. Williams replied, her voice soothing. "You've been very sick, but you're safe now." Tears welled up in David's eyes. "I want my mom," he said, his voice trembling. Mrs. Williams felt a lump in her throat. "She's been very worried about you. She's doing everything she can to make sure you get better." David's gaze drifted away, and he seemed to struggle to stay awake. Mrs. Williams stroked his hair gently, comforting him until he drifted back to sleep. As she sat there, she couldn't help but wonder what had led to this moment. She resolved to find out more about David's life and what might have caused his illness. Later that day, Ms. Ramirez returned to the hospital. She and Mrs. Williams met in the waiting area, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken concerns. "How is David doing?" Ms. Ramirez asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "He woke up for a little while," Mrs. Williams replied. "He asked for his mom. He seems so scared and confused." Ms. Ramirez nodded, her expression somber. "We've been looking into his family situation. It's worse than we thought. David's mother, Mrs. Sanchez, has been overwhelmed trying to support him. She works multiple jobs and has very little time to care for him properly. It seems like the exposure to the toxin was accidental, but it's a symptom of a much larger problem." Mrs. Williams felt a deep sadness for both David and his mother. "What can we do to help them?" "We're working on a plan," Ms. Ramirez said. "We're coordinating with local charities and social services to provide them with better living conditions and support. But it's going to take time." As they talked, Mrs. Williams thought about her own role in David's life. She had always tried to be a supportive teacher, but she realized now that she needed to do more. "I want to help too," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Ms. Ramirez gave her a grateful smile. "Your support means a lot, Mrs. Williams. Sometimes, knowing that someone cares can make all the difference." Over the next few days, Mrs. Williams dedicated herself to learning more about David. She spoke with his classmates, trying to piece together his life outside of school. She discovered that David often stayed late at the school library, avoiding going home. He spent a lot of time alone, reading books or drawing quietly. One afternoon, Mrs. Williams sat down with Emma, one of David's classmates who sometimes talked to him. "Emma, can you tell me a little about David? What's he like when he's not in class?" Mrs. Williams asked gently. Emma shrugged, looking a little nervous. "He's really quiet. He likes to read a lot. Sometimes we talk about books, but he doesn't say much about his family. I think he's kind of lonely." Mrs. Williams nodded, her heart aching for the lonely boy. "Has he ever mentioned anything about home? Anything that might help us understand what he's going through?" Emma thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Not really. He just seems sad sometimes. I wish I knew how to help him." "You're helping just by being his friend, Emma," Mrs. Williams said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Thank you for talking to me." After speaking with Emma and other students, Mrs. Williams realized that David had built a wall around himself, keeping his struggles hidden from everyone. She felt a renewed determination to break through that wall and make sure he got the support he needed. At the hospital, David's condition slowly improved. He was still weak, but the doctors were hopeful about his recovery. Mrs. Williams visited him every day, bringing books and small gifts to cheer him up. She could see the fear in his eyes gradually being replaced by a flicker of trust. One afternoon, as Mrs. Williams read to David from one of his favorite books, he looked up at her with a hesitant expression. "Why are you here every day?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Williams put the book down and smiled at him. "Because I care about you, David. I want to make sure you're all right." David seemed to ponder this for a moment. "Nobody's ever cared about me like this before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears sprang to Mrs. Williams' eyes. "You're not alone, David. There are so many people who care about you and want to help. We're going to make sure you're safe and happy." David nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As the days passed, Mrs. Williams continued to work closely with Ms. Ramirez and the social services team. They coordinated efforts to improve David's living conditions and provide support for Mrs. Sanchez. They arranged for counseling and financial assistance, ensuring that David would have a stable and nurturing environment to return to. Mrs. Williams also reached out to the school community, organizing a fundraiser to help cover some of the costs. The response was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, and students all came together to support David and his family. It was a powerful reminder of the strength of community and the impact of collective compassion. Through it all, Mrs. Williams felt a deep sense of purpose. She had always believed in the power of education to change lives, but this experience had shown her just how vital her role as a teacher could be. She wasn't just educating her students, she was nurturing them, protecting them, and advocating for them. One evening, as she sat by David's bedside, Mrs. Williams reflected on the journey they had been on. She thought about the frightened boy she had found in the park, and the brave young soul who was now beginning to heal. She knew there were still challenges ahead, but she also knew they would face them together. "David," she said softly, "you're going to be all right. We're all here for you, and we're going to make sure you have the support you need." David looked up at her, his eyes filled with hope. "I know," he said quietly. "Thank you for believing in me." As Mrs. Williams held his hand, she felt a profound sense of connection and fulfillment. This was what it meant to be a teacher. This was what it meant to make a difference. And she was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that together, they could overcome anything. As David continued to recover, Mrs. Williams remained a constant presence at the hospital. She knew the time was approaching when they would need to address the deeper issues behind David's illness. The doctors had confirmed that the toxin came from household cleaning products, but the underlying problems of neglect and instability had to be resolved. One morning, Mrs. Williams arrived at the hospital to find Ms. Ramirez waiting for her in the lobby. There was a sense of urgency in her expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," Ms. Ramirez greeted her. "I've spoken with Mrs. Sanchez, and she's agreed to let us visit her home again. I think it would be beneficial for you to come with me." Mrs. Williams nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. "Of course. I want to do whatever I can to help." The drive to David's house was somber. Mrs. Williams stared out the window, her mind filled with thoughts of what they might find. When they arrived, the small, dilapidated house seemed even more forlorn in the daylight. Mrs. Sanchez opened the door, her face drawn with worry and fatigue. "Thank you for coming," Mrs. Sanchez said softly, stepping aside to let them in. "I'm doing my best, but it's so hard." Ms. Ramirez gave her a reassuring smile. "We're here to help, not to judge. Let's sit down and talk about what we can do to improve things for you and David." They sat in the small living room, cluttered with laundry and dishes. Mrs. Williams could see the signs of a woman overwhelmed by the demands of life. She felt a deep sympathy for Mrs. Sanchez, who was clearly struggling to provide for her son under difficult circumstances. "Mrs. Sanchez, we found that David's exposure to the toxin was likely accidental, due to the cleaning products you use," Ms. Ramirez began gently. "We want to help you find safer alternatives and ensure that your home is a safe environment for David." Mrs. Sanchez's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt him. I was just trying to keep the house clean. I didn't know those products were dangerous." "We understand," Ms. Ramirez said kindly. "That's why we're here. We'll help you get the supplies you need and provide support so you can focus on caring for David." Mrs. Williams spoke up, her voice filled with empathy. "We're also organizing community support. There are people who want to help you, Mrs. Sanchez. You're not alone in this." Mrs. Sanchez wiped her eyes and nodded. "Thank you. I've been so afraid and ashamed. I didn't know where to turn." Ms. Ramirez reached out and took her hand. "You're not alone anymore. We'll work together to make things better for you and David." They spent the next few hours going through the house, identifying areas that needed improvement and making a plan for safer cleaning supplies and better living conditions. Mrs. Williams noted the broken furniture, the lack of proper storage, and the general disrepair of the house. It was clear that Mrs. Sanchez needed more than just new cleaning products. She needed a complete overhaul of her living situation. "We'll start with the basics," Ms. Ramirez said, making notes. "Safe cleaning supplies, financial assistance, and regular check-ins to make sure everything is on track." Mrs. Williams added, "And we'll organize a community effort to help with repairs and provide anything else you might need. David's school is also committed to supporting you." As they worked, Mrs. Sanchez began to open up about her struggles. She spoke of the long hours she worked, the difficulty of making ends meet, and the constant worry about David's well-being. Mrs. Williams listened, her heart aching for the woman who was doing her best under such trying circumstances. "I want to do better for David," Mrs. Sanchez said, her voice breaking. "I want to give him a better life." "You're already doing that by accepting help," Ms. Ramirez assured her. "We're going to make sure you have the resources and support you need to succeed." By the end of the visit, Mrs. Williams felt a renewed sense of hope. There was a lot of work to be done, but they had made a start. As they left the house, she turned to Ms. Ramirez. "Do you think we can really make a difference?" she asked, her voice filled with determination. Ms. Ramirez smiled. "I believe we can. It's going to take time and effort, but with the right support, I think we can help Mrs. Sanchez and David build a better future." Back at the hospital, Mrs. Williams shared the progress with David. He was sitting up in bed, looking stronger each day. His eyes lit up when she told him about the plans to improve his home. "Really? We're getting a new house?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. "Not a new house, but we're going to make your house better," Mrs. Williams replied, smiling. "We're going to make it a safe and happy place for you and your mom." David's face broke into a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I can't wait to go home." As the days turned into weeks, the community came together to support David and his mother. Volunteers helped with repairs, donations poured in, and a sense of unity and compassion spread throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Williams watched with pride as everyone worked together, knowing that their efforts were making a real difference. One evening, Mrs. Williams received a call from Ms. Ramirez. "Mrs. Sanchez wanted me to let you know that the house is ready for David to come home," she said. "We've made all the necessary improvements, and it's a much safer environment now." "That's wonderful news," Mrs. Williams replied, feeling a surge of happiness. "David will be so excited." The day David was discharged from the hospital was filled with mixed emotions. Mrs. Williams was overjoyed to see him healthy and eager to return home, but she also knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, but she was confident that together, they could overcome them. As they arrived at David's house, Mrs. Williams saw the changes immediately. The yard was tidy, the paint was fresh, and the inside of the house was clean and organized. Mrs. Sanchez greeted them with a tearful smile, hugging David tightly. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said, her voice choked with emotion. David looked around, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's so different." "Thank you, Mom." "Thank you, Mrs. Williams." Mrs. Williams knelt down beside him. "You're welcome, David. Remember, you're not alone. We're all here for you, every step of the way." As she left the house that evening, Mrs. Williams felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she also knew that they had built a strong foundation of support for David and his mother. They were no longer facing their struggles alone. And as the sun set on that hopeful day, Mrs. Williams looked forward to the future with renewed faith in the power of community and the enduring strength of love and compassion. As the weeks passed, the changes in David's life were profound. The improvements to his home created a safe and nurturing environment where he could thrive. Mrs. Sanchez was also getting the support she needed, attending counseling sessions and receiving financial assistance. The community's outpouring of generosity had been overwhelming, and Mrs. Williams felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude for everyone involved. One sunny Saturday morning, Mrs. Williams decided to visit David and Mrs. Sanchez. She brought along a few books and some art supplies for David, knowing how much he loved to read and draw. When she arrived, the transformation of their home was evident. The yard was well kept, flowers bloomed along the walkway, and the house itself looked bright and welcoming. Mrs. Sanchez greeted her at the door with a warm smile. "Mrs. Williams, thank you so much for coming. David is in his room, working on a drawing. He'll be so happy to see you." Mrs. Williams followed her into the house, feeling a sense of peace and accomplishment. She found David in his room, sitting at a small desk covered with papers and colored pencils. He looked up and grinned when he saw her. "Hi, Mrs. Williams. Look at what I'm drawing," he said, holding up a picture of a vibrant garden filled with flowers and butterflies. "That's beautiful, David," Mrs. Williams said, sitting down beside him. "You've become quite the artist." David blushed with pride. "Thanks. I've been practicing a lot. It helps me feel calm." Mrs. Williams smiled, touched by his words. "I'm glad to hear that. I brought you some new books and more art supplies. I thought you might like them." David's eyes lit up. "Thank you. You always know what I like." As they chatted, Mrs. Williams noticed how much healthier and happier David seemed. He was more talkative and engaged, a stark contrast to the quiet, withdrawn boy she had first met. The transformation was remarkable, and it filled her with hope for his future. Later, as they sat in the living room with Mrs. Sanchez, the conversation turned to the future. Mrs. Sanchez expressed her gratitude for all the support they had received. "I don't know how we would have made it without you and the community's help," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm doing my best to make a fresh start for us." "You're doing wonderfully," Mrs. Williams replied. "David is thriving, and that's a testament to your strength and love." David looked up from his drawing and smiled at his mother. "I'm really happy, Mom. I know things were tough, but it's better now." Mrs. Sanchez hugged him tightly. "We're going to be okay, David. We're going to make it." As the day turned to evening, Mrs. Williams said her goodbyes, promising to visit again soon. Walking home, she reflected on the journey they had all been on. It had been a long and difficult road, but the progress they had made was undeniable. Back at school, David's transformation continued. He was more engaged in class, participating in discussions, and making friends. Mrs. Williams watched with pride as he blossomed into a confident and happy child. She knew that the support he had received had made all the difference. One day, David approached her desk after class. "Mrs. Williams, can I ask you something?" "Of course, David." "What's on your mind?" she asked, looking up from her paperwork. "Do you think I could join the art club?" "I really like drawing, and I want to get better," he said, his eyes hopeful. Mrs. Williams smiled warmly. "I think that's a wonderful idea, David. I'll talk to the art teacher and make sure you can join. I'm sure you'll do great." David's face lit up with excitement. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I can't wait to start." As the weeks turned into months, David continued to thrive. He excelled in his classes, made new friends, and found a passion for art that gave him a sense of purpose and joy. Mrs. Sanchez also continued to make progress, with the support of the community helping her build a stable and loving home for her son. One spring afternoon, the school held an art show, showcasing the work of students from the art club. David's drawings were displayed prominently, and Mrs. Williams couldn't have been prouder. She watched as parents and teachers admired his work, and she saw the pride in David's eyes as he showed his drawings to his mother. "You've come so far, David," Mrs. Williams said, standing beside him. "I'm incredibly proud of you." David smiled up at her. I couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. Williams. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Tears filled Mrs. Williams' eyes as she hugged him. "You're a remarkable young man, David. Your future is bright, and I'm so excited to see all the wonderful things you'll achieve." As the art show came to a close, Mrs. Williams felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had dedicated her life to teaching, believing in the potential of every child she met. David's journey had reaffirmed that belief in the most profound way. Later that evening, as she walked home, Mrs. Williams reflected on the power of community and compassion. The support that had poured out for David and his mother had changed their lives, but it had also touched everyone involved. It was a reminder that, despite the challenges and hardships, there was always hope in the possibility of a better future. In the months that followed, Mrs. Williams continued to support David and his mother, always there to lend a helping hand or a kind word. She watched with pride as David continued to grow and thrive, knowing that the bonds they had formed would last a lifetime. And so, the story of David and Mrs. Williams came to a close, not with an ending, but with a new beginning. It was a story of resilience, of the power of love and community, and of the belief that even in the darkest times, there is always a light to guide the way. As Mrs. Williams looked out over the city, the sun setting in a blaze of color, she felt a profound sense of peace. The world was indeed a better place, and there were still good people willing to make a difference. And in that moment, she knew that the journey was far from over, but the future was bright, filled with endless possibilities and the promise of hope.